50 years ago, a group of self-described revolutionaries did something that shocked the world. In just 2 years, they declared war on America, assassinated a beloved school superintendent, robbed several banks, bombed several police cars, murdered an innocent bystander, kidnapped heiress Patty Hearst, and convinced her to join their cause before most of the group burned to death in a fiery shootout in Los Angeles, right on live television. This webcast is about everything that made that story possible, and almost none of it is what I expected to find when I started looking. I came to this project with a set of beliefs about the Symbionese Liberation Army and the era that produced them. I had to dismantle most of those beliefs before I could tell this story honestly. This is the story of who the SLA really were, what they actually believed, and what it tells us about a nation that is still grappling with the same failures that produced them. This is House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution.
The night of November 6, 1973, Sinque, Zoya, and Vahiza drove away from a parking lot in Oakland, believing they had done something historic. They had planned it carefully. They had thought through every contingency and eliminated every possibility of failure. They executed the action with the discipline that months of training had built into them. And now they were gone, clean into the Oakland night, and the revolution was beginning. They were certain of that. The communique was ready. Vahiza had written it with the urgency she brought to everything. The declaration that the court of the people had sentenced a fascist agent, that the SLA had carried out the sentence, that the people should understand what had been done on their behalf and why. It would go out to the media. It would announce them, the Symbionese Liberation Army. And the response from the radical left, from the prison movement, from the Black community that the ideology had designated as the revolutionary class, would confirm that this was the moment, that this was the action, that the war had finally and irrevocably begun. Before we get to what that response actually was, before we follow the SLA into the devastating cascade of consequences that the Foster assassination set in motion, this episode needs to go back to a question that the previous episode circled without fully answering. Why Marcus Foster? Not in the ideological sense. We have examined the ideology. We know what the manifesto said about collaborators and fascist agents and the flexibility of the enemy list. We know that Theodore Wheeler raised Foster's name in October, that the identification card controversy had given the Bay Area radical press a frame for criticizing Foster, that the SLA absorbed and amplified into something unrecognizable, that Willie Wolfe attended the October 9th school board meeting and watched Foster explicitly reverse course on both contested policies and came back and said nothing that changed the organization's direction. We know all of that. What this episode asks is how far back does the targeting of Marcus Foster actually go? Because evidence suggests that the path from the BCA meetings at Vacaville, where many in this group first met each other, to the parking lot behind the Oakland Board of Education building, is more direct than it appears, and that Donald DeFreeze was not a wild-eyed prison revolutionary who arrived independently at the conclusion that Oakland's first Black school superintendent needed to die. Colston Westbrook, facilitator of the BCA during those meetings, had called Marcus Foster a fascist. In the conversations that shaped the early ideological formation of the organization that would become the SLA, Westbrook, the CIA-connected operative who had cultivated DeFreeze's revolutionary identity and engineered his access to the white radicals who became the SLA's core, had designated Foster as an enemy. Wheeler was not the first person to raise that flag. Westbrook did. The charge was, by any assessment of Foster's record, completely detached from reality. Calling him a fascist required either profound ignorance of his actual work or a deliberate inversion of it. Westbrook did not appear to be profoundly ignorant. The question worth asking is what Westbrook and the interests behind him stood to gain from Marcus Foster's death. Foster was building multiracial coalitions, distributing institutional power to communities historically excluded from it, demonstrating in practice that slow institution building could produce real change in Black Oakland, living proof that the radical left's theory of vanguard violence was unnecessary. Assassinating Foster accomplished something law enforcement surveillance alone could not. It discredited the very idea that this kind of work was possible and handed the state a story about radical violence that buried the underlying argument under decades of true crime fascination. Whether that outcome was engineered or simply convenient, the historical record cannot cleanly answer. The most disturbing question this episode raises is not whether DeFreeze was being directed. The evidence for that is substantial. It's something more personal. At what point did Cinque understand he was expected to stand in that parking lot himself and to kill a man? The morning after Marcus Foster was assassinated, a document arrived at KPFA, the Berkeley radio station that had been the voice of the Bay Area left for decades. It was typed. The heading was Symbionese Liberation Army, Western Regional Youth Unit, Communique Number 1. The subject line read, "The Board of Education Implementation of Internal Warfare Identification Computer System. Warrant order execution by cyanide bullets." The document stated that elements of the United Federated Forces of the SLA had attacked the Fascist Board of Education of Oakland through the persons of Dr. Marcus A. Foster, Superintendent of Schools, and Robert Blackburn, Deputy Superintendent. It described the action as a warrant issued by the Court of the People. It accused Foster of implementing a political police force in the schools and building surveillance files on Black youth through what it called a forced youth identification program. The document closed, as all SLA communications would close, with the line about the venom of the 7 heads destroying the fascist insect. The police detectives working the Foster assassination read the communique and had questions. Who was the Symbionese Liberation Army? Nobody in Bay Area law enforcement had heard of them. The name did not appear in any file, any surveillance report, any informant's account of radical organizations operating in the region. The Bay Area left was extensively monitored, extensively infiltrated, and extensively documented by local law enforcement, the FBI, and various state and federal agencies tracking radical organizations since the late 1960s. The August 21st manifesto, written like Communique Number 1 by Faiza, had been an internal document until the Foster assassination. Not released to the press, not shared beyond the SLA. They had effectively declared war 11 weeks earlier and told nobody. The initial instinct among investigators was skepticism. Political assassinations generated false claims of responsibility. The possibility that the communique was an opportunistic fabrication, that whoever killed Marcus Foster was not necessarily connected to the document that arrived at KPFA, had to be considered. Then the autopsy results came back. Alan McNeil was the pathologist assigned to conduct Marcus Foster's autopsy. He was a careful, experienced forensic examiner, and the examination of Foster's body gave him the findings he expected from a multiple gunshot wound fatality. 8 entry and exit wounds, the final shot to the back of the neck, having severed the spinal column. death having occurred rapidly and certainly at the scene. And then, during the examination, McNeil found a bullet that had passed entirely through Foster's body and come to rest inside his front shirt pocket. He removed it. He held it. And then, in the reflex of a forensic pathologist examining recovered ammunition, he brought it toward his nose. He stopped. McNeil had a genetic disposition, relatively rare and professionally useful in ways most people would not anticipate, that allowed him to detect the smell of cyanide. The odor is distinctive to those who can perceive it, something close to burned almonds. Faint but unmistakable once you know what you are smelling. He invited his assistant and an Oakland police sergeant to smell the bullet as well. They shrugged. They detected nothing unusual. McNeil was certain the bullet had been treated with cyanide. The horror of the cyanide detail landed across the Bay Area with a force that the communique's political language could not have generated on its own. Political assassinations, however terrible, carry a certain grim legibility. A political figure is killed by people who oppose what that figure represents. The ideology is the explanation. The violence, however condemned, is at least comprehensible in its logic. What the cyanide-tipped bullets communicated was something different. A level of preparation, of thoroughness, of cold, deliberate intent that moved the killing out of the register of political violence and into a different category of act altogether. The Oakland School Board, in an emergency session, expressed what many in the city were feeling. Board member Daniel Cook said publicly that whoever had done this had not struck a blow for any community. They had taken from Oakland the person most committed to its children's future. The district was, in Cook's words, left without its most essential voice at the moment it needed that voice most. California Governor Ronald Reagan issued a statement calling the assassination a shocking act of violence and directing state law enforcement to assist in the investigation. The statement was notable primarily for what it did not contain: any acknowledgement that Marcus Foster had spent 3 years doing exactly the work that Reagan's own educational policies had made harder. Oakland's Mayor John Reading called the killing a tragedy for the entire city and established a reward for information leading to the arrest of the killers. The Oakland Unified School District suspended classes for a day of mourning. The buildings that Marcus Foster had spent 3 years trying to make safer, more engaging, more worthy of the children who filled them went quiet. The communique claimed that Black, Chicano, Asian, and conscious white youth in Oakland and Berkeley recognized the importance of the area to the liberation struggle of all oppressed people. It positioned the SLA's action as the opening of a broader revolutionary campaign that the communities of the Bay Area were waiting to join. The communities of the Bay Area were not waiting to join it. The radical left, the organizations whose rhetoric had fed the SLA's manifesto, whose analysis of American racial capitalism had been woven into the group's foundational documents, whose names had been invoked as ancestors and predecessors, looked at the communique and produced not solidarity but silence and then condemnation. The Venceremos network, from which several SLA members had come, did not celebrate. The prison movement, whose intellectual framework the SLA had drawn on most heavily, did not celebrate. The vanguard theory held that the exemplary action of a small, committed group would inspire the masses to rise. The masses of the Bay Area radical left were not rising. They were trying to figure out who the Symbionese Liberation Army was and why they had murdered a good and effective civil servant. The SLA had announced themselves. The world was confused, horrified, and in Oakland, grieving. They had fired the first shot of their revolution. The revolution had not started. The Foucault theory held that a small revolutionary vanguard, through exemplary acts of violence, would ignite a larger uprising among the masses. Regis Debray had articulated it. Che Guevara had died trying to prove it in Bolivia. The SLA had built its entire operational philosophy around it. The assassination of Marcus Foster was the first attempt to put the theory into practice. The masses did not rise. Oakland mourned. Thousands of people, black and white, radical and conservative, Black Panthers and the city's clergy, along with school teachers, parents, and city council members, filled memorial services for Marcus Foster in the days following the assassination. The grief was not performative or politically organized. It was the genuine community-wide grief of a city that had lost someone it trusted with something irreplaceable. The Panthers, whose rhetoric the SLA had drawn on most heavily, whose analysis had been woven into the SLA's manifesto, whose name had been invoked as ancestor and predecessor and justification, the Black Panthers looked at what the SLA had done and called it a brutal and senseless murder. Their initial statement suggested that powerful fascist forces were behind the assassination, because the idea that anyone claiming to act in the name of Black liberation had murdered Marcus Foster was almost too dissonant to process. It was only when the communique arrived at KPFA that the full picture began to emerge. The Panthers did not celebrate when it did. The silence resolved into something more specific: condemnation. Black leaders across the Bay Area denounced the murder. The organized left rejected the action and the ideology behind it with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. The communities the SLA claimed to represent had not been waiting for a vanguard to act on their behalf. They had been going to work, raising children, attending school board meetings, building the institutions that Marcus Foster had spent his life trying to strengthen. They looked at what the SLA had done and said, in the most unambiguous possible terms, not in our name. The prisons, the constituency the SLA had most counted on, the revolutionary class the entire organizational philosophy had been built around reaching, were silent. No voice from inside the California prison system celebrated the assassination of Marcus Foster. The men who had read Jackson and Fanon and Mao in their cells, who had talked revolution with the Vacaville volunteers, who were supposed to recognize in the SLA's action the signal they had been waiting for, said nothing. Or rather, what they said in the conversations that reached the outside was roughly what everyone else was saying. This was not what the ideology had prepared for. The SLA's response to near universal condemnation was the only response the closed room had available to it. It doubled down. A second communique followed within days after the Oakland school system suspended the identification card program in response to community pressure. The program the SLA had used to justify Foster's murder, removed by the very democratic process the SLA had declared useless, rather than acknowledging the obvious implication that Foster had been killed for a policy the community had already rejected through legitimate channels. The second communique deepened the indictment. It noted that Foster had once been a member of the Philadelphia Crime Commission and asked, with the rhetorical swagger of people who believe they have found a devastating argument, who ever heard of Martin Luther King on the Philadelphia Crime Commission? The comparison was designed to reframe Foster from a community institution builder into a collaborator with the criminal justice apparatus. The forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army remind the enemy-rich ruling class that the people will always understand the effectiveness and tactics of revolutionary justice and will never be deceived by the distortions and lies of the fascist news media. This is the closed system at its most visible and most instructive. The manifesto had an answer for rejection built into its architecture. If the people did not rise, they were not yet conscious enough to understand. If the radical left condemned the action, it had been co-opted. If the prisons were silent, the prison system's power was still too complete to allow voices of support to emerge. Every piece of contradicting evidence was reinterpreted within the ideology's own framework as confirmation of the ideology. The broader American left's response came more slowly as the SLA's existence filtered beyond the Bay Area. When it came, it was not more generous than Oakland's had been. Bernadine Dorn, the Weather Underground leader, who had herself crossed into political violence, who had bombed the Capitol and the Pentagon, who had evaded the FBI for years, issued a statement that was the most devastating assessment the SLA would receive from anyone who might have been expected to understand what they were trying to do. She said, "We do not comprehend the execution of Marcus Foster, and we respond very soberly to the death of a Black person who is not a recognized enemy of the people." Bernadine Dorn, a woman who had dedicated her life to a violent revolution against the American state, could not make sense of what the SLA had done, not because she objected to revolutionary violence in principle, because Marcus Foster was not the enemy. The Weather Underground had maintained a commitment to avoiding civilian casualties. Dorn and her colleagues had built their operational philosophy around that distinction. They looked at the SLA's action and saw not a more committed version of what they were doing, but something categorically different. Something that had violated the most fundamental distinction between oppressor and oppressed. If Bernadine Dorn and the Weather Underground could not comprehend it, the SLA had managed something remarkable. They had placed themselves beyond the pale of even the most committed sector of the American underground left. Shortly before Foster's assassination, Syngkyu, Faiza, and Zoya left the Berkeley apartment they'd been sharing. The core trio, along with Bo and Osceola, understood they'd need somewhere far removed from wherever the search would eventually concentrate, somewhere outside Berkeley and Oakland. Osceola and Faiza signed a lease using the names George and Nancy Devoto on an unremarkable 3-bedroom house at 1560 Sutherland Court, tucked into a quiet middle-class subdivision in Concord. It was more than 20 miles from Berkeley, a placid suburb with nothing about it to suggest the volatile history the people moving in were bringing with them. Thera Wheeler and Mary Alice Seam had left before the murder of Marcus Foster, unwilling to embrace violence against individuals. But for Bill and Emily Harris, the assassination did not deter them. They had been watching from the edges of the organization, not yet members, still orbiting the core group. In early December, they were blindfolded and driven to the Sutherland courthouse for what amounted to an audition. DeFreeze approved them. They quit their jobs. They became formally and finally part of what the SLA had become. They joined an organization that had just committed a murder the entire movement had condemned. They joined knowing this. They joined anyway. Bill and Emily, now Tico and Yolanda. At this point, names were being chosen not because they meant something in Swahili or the streets of Montevideo, but because they sounded Black.
Greetings of profound love to the people, to all comrades in arms, to all comrades in the concentration camps of fascist America, and to all the children. This is Yolanda speaking. When we say revolution, we do not use the word loosely. By revolution, we mean the violent fight for freedom, freedom that can be gained in no other way than by fighting. People do not fight because they enjoy it, or because they relish the thought of their own death or the deaths of their beloved comrades. They fight to survive because they understand the violence of fascism.
Inside the house on Sutherland Court in Concord, behind drawn curtains and nailed-down shutters, the SLA absorbed the response to the Foster assassination and drew the only conclusion the closed room permitted. They had not yet found the right action. Not the wrong cause, not the wrong ideology, the wrong action. The vanguard theory was intact. The diagnosis was intact. What needed adjustment was the prescription. Murder, it turned out, was a difficult thing to make legible as revolution, particularly the murder of a Black educator whose community had mourned him in the thousands. The spectacle had not produced the effect the theory promised. The masses had not risen. The radical left had not rallied. The prisons had not spoken. What the Foster assassination had produced, in practical terms, was a manhunt and a wall of condemnation from the very communities the SLA claimed to represent. Emily Harris, Yolanda, noted that DeFreeze was rarely dominant in political discussions. The only time he got excited, she said, was when he thought someone hadn't really internalized some aspect of racism. He usually talked less than anyone else. Bill Harris remembered him standing in front of a mirror for hours, practicing his aim. Unable in those early months to go to the shooting range without risking exposure, he trained on his own reflection. The image is both pathetic and revealing. A man performing revolution for an audience of one in a room full of people who needed him to be more than he was. Sing Q was not deterred. He was recalibrating. The recalibration led him toward an idea the international revolutionary movement had been developing for years, an idea with a track record, a theoretical framework, and a well-documented set of precedents. An idea that offered, in the logic of the organization's thinking, something that murder had not: leverage. The idea was kidnapping. The Tupamaros had a well-thumbed presence in the Sutherland courthouse. The Movimiento de Liberación Nacional of Uruguay had been, in their brief and extraordinary heyday in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the most tactically sophisticated urban guerrilla organization in the world, a group that had developed kidnapping into a political instrument with a precision and discipline that the international left had studied with something approaching admiration. The SLA had a set of interviews with Tupamaro leaders explaining the theory and practice of revolutionary kidnapping. They had also seen the film State of Siege, Costa Gavras' 1972 dramatization of the Tupamaros' kidnapping of a U.S. aid official revealed to be a CIA operative. The film had circulated through radical circles as both political education and tactical manual. The SLA were not just watching a film, but taking notes. The Tupamaro model was elegant in ways the SLA found compelling. In their active years, the organization had taken prisoner a score of prominent Uruguayan figures: bankers, judges, diplomats, political leaders. They held their captives in what they called the People's Jail, hidden cells in safe houses across Montevideo, where prisoners were kept alive, fed, and subjected to political education while their captors negotiated with the government and issued communiques to the press. The kidnappings generated international attention. They generated leverage. They generated funding. One case in particular had been underlined and annotated in the documents the SLA was working from. The Tupamaros had kidnapped Homero Farina, the editor of a right-wing Uruguayan newspaper. The purpose was not primarily financial, but symbolic, to make visible the role that a certain class of media played in maintaining the existing order, to force a public reckoning with institutions that preferred to operate without scrutiny. In their own words, kidnapping as opposed to murder. This was what passed for moderation in the Tupamaro lexicon, and it was exactly the distinction the SLA was now reaching for. Murder had produced condemnation. Kidnapping, the right kidnapping, of the right target, executed with the right demands, might produce something else. The list making began. The SLA was, by this point, an organization of diligent list makers. Baiza's to-do lists had documented the mundane logistics of revolution. Now the lists turned to something more specific and more consequential. Names, potential targets. The criteria were not complicated, but they required research and deliberation. Maximum publicity, maximum leverage, maximum symbolic value. The target had to represent something, had to embody the fascist capitalist class and its agents in a way that would be legible to the people the SLA claimed to be fighting for. There were nearly 24 names on the lists at various points, mostly local bankers and corporate executives, the human faces of the institutional structures the manifesto designated as the enemy. Raymond Pecunier, the director of the California Department of Corrections, appeared again, as he had when the organization was considering assassinations. The prison system remained, ideologically, the most potent symbol available to the SLA's argument. Draft communiques were written for each potential target. One was headed, "Kidnap and ransom and/or execution for failure to meet," a formulation that captured with inadvertent precision the combination of menace and negotiation that the Tupamaro model had refined into a political tool. The target named in that document was an executive at the Kaiser Corporation. Another draft named a figure from a regional candy company with the same heading and the same implicit threat. The communiques were written in the now familiar SLA style, the elaborate revolutionary language, the references to the court of the people, the invocations of the seven-headed cobra. They were also written with a deliberate inflation of the organization's apparent size and reach. Each was headed Western Regional Unit 10, as if the SLA had additional regional units, as if the Western unit was the 10th of many, as if the organization was a national network rather than a group of people in a house in Concord with the curtains taped down. The manhunt for Foster's killers had changed the operational conditions significantly. Their days were structured around preparation. Calisthenics in the morning, weapons training, bomb building, writing, always writing, the communiques accumulating. There were at least 10 separate draft communiques prepared, each a public explanation of a planned bombing targeting a multinational corporation, the Bank of America, ITT, General Tire. The companies the SLA's ideology had designated as the most visible instruments of the capitalist order they were at war with. The Harrises and Jelena were frequent visitors to the Sutherland house, moving between it and their own lives in ways that maintained the appearance of ordinary Bay Area existence while the organization's preparations intensified. When the assassination produced not solidarity, but near universal condemnation, Kajot was as genuinely shocked as Sin-Q was. The man who had unknowingly helped supply the rationale for Foster's death had not anticipated what that death would cost the organization or what it would feel like to watch the consequences unfold. Shaken, he went home to his father's house in Pennsylvania for Christmas and began, for the first time, seriously weighing whether to leave the SLA altogether. Foster's murder had done something nothing else had managed. It had cracked his confidence in Sin-Q. The kidnapping target was not yet chosen. The list was long, and the criteria were being applied with the deliberateness of people who understood that the next action had to work, had to produce the response the Foster assassination had failed to produce, had to generate the publicity and the leverage and the symbolic weight that would force the country to engage with the argument the manifesto had been making. The organization read the newspapers obsessively, not just the underground press that had been feeding their ideology, but the mainstream papers, the society pages, the obituaries and community notices, and profiles of prominent families. They were looking for someone, a figure who embodied the fascist capitalist class in a way that was both personally specific and symbolically legible. Someone whose name meant something. Someone whose disappearance would be impossible to ignore. The name they would eventually settle on was there, somewhere, in the newspapers they were reading, in the society pages, in the profiles of prominent California families. They hadn't found it yet, but they were looking. In the early morning hours of January 10, 1974, a Concord police officer named David Douge was patrolling the quiet residential streets of his city when he noticed a van that didn't belong. It was around 1 a.m., when suburban streets are at their most empty. Something about the van, the hour, the location, the way it was moving through otherwise still streets, registered as wrong to a police officer whose instincts had been developed through years of patrol. Douge pulled it over. The driver handed him a license in the name of Robert Scalise. The passenger sat in silence and, when asked, provided his name as Ramiro. Douge looked at the van more carefully. The back was separated from the front by heavy black curtains, floor to ceiling, making it impossible to see what was behind them. He asked the driver what he was doing in this neighborhood at this hour. Scalise said he was looking for the home of a friend named Devoto who lived on Sutherland Court. He said he was lost. The explanation was plausible and entirely insufficient. Douge ran the names from his patrol car. Nothing came back, no outstanding warrants, no flags. Yet his instincts were not satisfied. He sat for a moment thinking, then walked back to the van, tapped on the glass, and asked the passenger to step out. "Do you have any guns or knives on you?" he asked. "I'm going to frisk you." He reached toward Ramiro. Ramiro took a quick step back and in a single motion pulled open his jacket. The bulge near his waist was unmistakable. Douge ran. He covered the distance to his patrol car in a compressed, instinctive sprint before his mind fully processed that he was about to be shot at. He put the car between himself and Ramiro and crouched behind it, just as Ramiro fired, 2 blasts in rapid succession, the muzzle flashes lighting the dark of the empty street with a staccato brightness that lasted a fraction of a second. Douge fired back twice. Ramiro fired twice more. The whole exchange lasted perhaps 4 seconds. The street went dark and quiet again. Douge got on his radio. "Concord, 1199, officer in trouble. I've been shot at." Behind him, the van's engine turned over. Russell Little, Osceola, pulled away from the curb and drove into the tangle of Concord's residential streets. He was trying to run, trying to put distance between himself and the man he had just watched exchange gunfire with his companion, trying to find a route out of the subdivision and into the anonymity of the larger city. He had told Douge he was lost. Now he was. The streets of a residential subdivision at 1 a.m. looked different from behind a windshield with adrenaline in your blood and no landmarks you recognize. Osceola drove. He turned, he drove again. The streets folded back on themselves the way suburban streets do. And the landmarks he thought he remembered turned out to be the same landmark passed a different way, and the route out kept not appearing, and after some unmeasured stretch of time he found himself exactly where he had started. Douge's backup had arrived. The scene was quiet, and then the van came barreling back out of the dark, disoriented too fast, and the backup officer swung his vehicle across the road and blocked it. Osceola brought the van to a stop with a screech of brakes. The backup officer stepped out with a shotgun leveled at the windshield. "Police, come out with your hands up." Osceola was pulled from the van and ordered to the ground. The officers moved quickly and efficiently. His pockets were searched. They found ammunition, 14 rounds in one pocket, 13 in the other, the deliberate preparation of a man who had expected to need them. An empty holster sat on his waist. When the officers asked where the gun was, Osceola gestured toward the driver's seat, where a .38 Colt revolver lay beside a rifle. As they pulled him upright, they noticed the blood, a graze wound on his right shoulder. Douge's return fire had found him, after all, the bullet catching the edge of him as it passed. One of the officers pushed the black curtains aside and looked into the back of the van. Hundreds of leaflets, freshly printed, stacked with the tidiness of materials prepared carefully and stored with intention. Each one bore a 7-headed cobra. For more than 2 months, law enforcement across the Bay Area had been working the Foster assassination with almost nothing to show for it. They had a name, the Symbionese Liberation Army, and a communique that had proven its own authenticity through the cyanide detail. But law enforcement had no faces, no address, no leads that had gone anywhere. Their eyes were open now. The passenger who had fired on Officer Douge was not in the van. Beau had run the moment the shooting stopped, bolting on foot into the residential darkness while Osceola was trying to drive away, and the officers who swarmed the neighborhood in the hours that followed could not find him. Streets were sealed. Yards were searched. Officers moved through backyards and between houses with flashlights, calling to each other in the tense shorthand of a manhunt in progress. The search expanded outward from the initial scene and then contracted back when the expanding circle produced nothing. An hour passed, then another, then another. The neighborhood stayed quiet. The officers kept looking. Beau kept hiding. The darkness that had been his cover when he ran was now his prison. The same unfamiliar streets that had trapped Osceola, trapping him too, just on foot rather than behind a wheel. At 5:31 in the morning, 4 hours and 21 minutes after the initial confrontation, with the first suggestion of dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky, a patrol officer moving through a residential block saw a figure dart between 2 houses. He stopped. He raised his weapon. He called out. A voice came from the darkness between the houses. It was tired and flat and entirely without drama. "I've had it. I give up. I'm coming out." Beau, Joe Ramiro, walked out of the half-light with his hands raised. He was cold. He'd been running and hiding for 4 hours, and he was done. Before being asked, he told the officer, "It's in my right pants pocket." The officer reached in and found a Walther PP .380 automatic pistol. He recognized it from the evidence bulletin circulating through Bay Area law enforcement for 2 months. It was one of the weapons used to kill Marcus Foster. Russell Little and Joe Ramiro, Osceola and Beau, were in custody as the sun came up over Concord on January 10, 1974. Osceola was in a police car with a graze wound on his shoulder and his hands cuffed behind him. Beau was in a different police car, tired and cold, the murder weapon taken from his pocket. They were facing charges of murder and conspiracy in the assassination of Marcus Foster. The evidence in the van connected them to the SLA. The gun in Beau's pocket connected them to the parking lot behind the Oakland Board of Education building on the night of November 6th. The safe house at 1560 Sutherland Court was approximately 2 blocks from where Joe Ramiro had been taken into custody in the pre-dawn darkness. Word reached the house before the police did. Someone in the network had learned of the arrests, and the SLA had contingency plans for exactly this scenario because Beau had written them. His emergency protocol for a police confrontation was detailed. Members were to station themselves either in the crawl space beneath the building or behind barricades of bundled newspapers on the upper floor. Everyone was to keep their handgun on their person at all times. Ammunition and rifles were to be kept together and ready to carry out immediately. The instructions included 2 details that were entirely practical and entirely revealing of the life lived inside it. Always know where your shoes are, and always know where your Molotov cocktails are. Beau and Osceola were now being processed by the police, and the people inside Sutherland Court had no intention of making a last stand. They needed to run, But first, they needed to deal with the evidence. The house contained everything. It contained the documents and the notebooks and the communiques and the lists, the meticulous, obsessive archive of the organization's intentions assembled over months. It contained the weapons and the ammunition, .30 caliber, 9mm, .38 special, .45 caliber, .30-06 12-gauge shotgun shells, boxes and boxes of rounds. It contained gas masks and stolen license plates and stacks of gun and ammunition catalogs. It contained posters of Mao and Stalin on the walls and photographs of police officers alongside revolutionary slogans, some of them signed with a single word: sin. It contained the lists of kidnapping targets, mostly local corporate executives, names and addresses and notes on their movements, along with the well-thumbed research materials and the draft communiques prepared for each of them. And it contained something else buried in the boxes of documents that nobody had yet thought to treat as the most important thing in the room. They needed to destroy all of it. Faiza had a plan. She was going to burn the house to the ground. She and Zoya worked through the afternoon. They bought gasoline and brought it back to the house. They spread gunpowder throughout the rooms, along the floors, across the surfaces, into the corners where the papers were stacked. They laid a 6-inch fuse leading to a puddle of gasoline with streaks of fuel running from it in multiple directions, designed to carry the fire through every room simultaneously. Zoya and Senkyu left first, taking what they could carry. Faiza stayed behind to light the fuse. She was the last one out, running for the 1967 Oldsmobile that Kajou had left parked outside. The fuse caught. There was a bang. The car peeled out of the driveway and out of sight. And then the fire went out. Faiza had forgotten to open the windows. The house was too tightly sealed. The shuttered windows starved the fire of the oxygen it needed. The conflagration she had imagined, that consuming fire that would reduce the evidence to ash and the house to a ruin, produced instead one bang, some scorching, the smell of smoke, and almost nothing else. The trove of evidence inside Sutherland Court was scarcely singed. The police arrived to find a partially burned house full of everything the SLA tried to destroy. The Concord authorities, unused to processing a crime scene of this complexity, failed to secure the premises. Journalists arrived. Curiosity seekers arrived. People walked through the partially burned interior and touched things and moved things and in some cases took things. Paul Avery of the San Francisco Chronicle was among the reporters who got inside. The house was unfurnished in any conventional sense. Mattresses on the floor, wooden crates for furniture. There were several typewriters and a mimeograph machine, boxes and loose handfuls of bullets in every caliber the organization had been using. The walls were covered with posters, Mao and Stalin, alongside photographs of police officers and revolutionary slogans signed by Senkyu. More than 100 newspaper and magazine clippings about foreign guerrillas and revolutionary movements, their in-house research library. There were gas masks, bandoliers, stacks of gun and ammo catalogs with pages marked, 3 BB guns alongside the real weapons, stolen license plates, ammonium nitrate and other bomb-making materials. And on a workbench, a drill and a plastic container labeled cyanide and water, along with a supply of 38 caliber rounds with hollow points filled with the contents of that container. The boxes of documents and notebooks filled with Faiza's tiny insistent handwriting and Beau's military planning and the accumulated paper record of months of revolutionary preparation were carried out and cataloged. Among them were the lists of kidnapping targets, the corporate executives, the local figures, the names the organization had been researching and compiling and drafting communiques for. And among those names was one that the police, in the chaos of processing an unprecedented crime scene in a suburb that had never seen anything like this, did not elevate above the others, did not flag as requiring immediate protective action, did not warn the person whose name was written there. Her name was Patricia Campbell Hearst. The SLA were already moving, already finding the next place. The first option was a house at 514 Winchester Street in Daly City, on the other side of the bay from Concord. It lasted days. The landlord made clear he would keep his own key, and an organization that had learned operational security from months of living behind nailed-down shades was not going to accept that. On January 20th, Zoya and Yolanda, presenting themselves as TWA flight attendants, a cover story their new landlord found credible if slightly puzzling, rented a 3-bedroom stucco house at 37 Northridge Drive in Daly City for $265 a month plus a $50 deposit. The tenants immediately installed a heavy-duty bolt lock on the front door to which the landlord would not have a key. And they made another modification. In the walk-in closet of the master bedroom, they changed the door hardware so that it could not be opened from the inside. The full organization reassembled at Northridge Drive. Q, Zoya, Baiza, Tico, Yolanda, Jelena. Sleeping bags on the floor, weapons packed and papers stacked. The organization battered and reorganized and smaller now, but still certain and still looking for the action that would change everything. Russell Little and Joe Ramiro did not kill Marcus Foster. In the weeks and months that followed their arrest, as charges were filed and evidence cataloged and the legal machinery of the state began the slow work of building a case, the public understanding of the Foster assassination would attach itself to the 2 men caught with the murder weapon and the SLA leaflets. Osceola and Bo, the Florida boy who had dreamed of being an astronaut, the combat veteran who had seen enough death in Vietnam to last several lifetimes and had come home and found in revolutionary politics a framework for the fury that would not leave him. They were in custody. They would spend years there. But the people who actually stood in that parking lot on the night of November 6th, who fired the shots and stood over Marcus Foster's body and delivered the final fatal bullet, were sleeping on the floor of a house in Daly City with their weapons around them, planning what came next. Baiza had fired first, the Walther PP 380 in her hands, the same gun later found in Bo's pocket. Then Q had fired, striking Deputy Superintendent Robert Blackburn with pellets from a Remington shotgun, 23 entry and exit wounds. And finally, Zoya had walked calmly toward a fallen man and fired into the back of his neck. They killed Marcus Foster, and their comrades were arrested for it. They knew this. They were living with it. Baiza especially was living with something additional. Bo and Osceola had each briefly been her lover. She had been inside those relationships with the same ferocious intensity she brought to everything. And now those men were in jail for a crime she had committed. And she was in a Daly City house installing a lock on the outside of a closet door. Willie Wolfe had gone home to Pennsylvania shaken. The universal condemnation of Foster's murder had introduced a doubt that the closed room was not designed to accommodate. Joe was, by the Christmas of 1973, genuinely considering not going back. He had met a young Swedish woman. He was thinking about going overseas to meet her. He told his father on January 10th that he was moving to Sweden to get married. The next day, Tico called him 3 times, collect calls directed by Q, the organization reaching across the country to retrieve what it needed. Bo and Osceola had just been arrested. The organization, Harris pleaded, needed him back. When Tico finally reached him, Joe expressed his doubt gently. I don't know, he said. I think I might be a liability. If someone comes at me, I don't know if I could shoot them. Tico reassured him. oh, we're not going to have to shoot anybody. This is just armed propaganda. It was a lie delivered to a young man whose goodness was both the thing being exploited and the thing being betrayed. What the organization needed was not Cajo, the nascent radical, not his revolutionary commitment or his courage or his connections. They needed his car, which they had already taken, and they needed his money. After the last call with Tico, Cajo told his father he was going to New York to visit a sick friend. Instead, he went west. He went back to the organization that had decided what he was worth was what he could fund. The idealist who had first walked into Vacaville to write a term paper, stayed to volunteer literacy lessons, written home to his mother about the lobotomies and druggings, and yet kept going back, who had told Bill Harris he didn't know if he could shoot someone. That person was going back to California to help finance the next chapter of a story he did not fully understand he was in. The first 6 episodes of this series have been about a world, an ideology, a group, and a murder. What comes next is about what that group did with the momentum of that murder and what it cost everyone it touched. But the story you are about to hear is not primarily about a kidnapping. It is not primarily about a famous name or a famous photograph or a famous trial. It is about what a closed room does to an open mind, about the documented, carefully observed process by which a person is separated from everything that made them themselves and rebuilt into something the room requires, about how long it takes, about how completely and effectively it can be done. And it is about how any of us, given the right conditions, the isolation, the perfect combination of fear and dependency and love and ideology, might not be as immune to it as we would like to believe.
Thank you for listening to House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution. This is H. Allegra Lansing. This is a story about a country at war with itself, and about what happens when a generation's fury collapses into the worst possible reaction. The Symbionese Liberation Army did not fail because the injustice they saw wasn't real. They failed because they chose violence, and violence is the one form of resistance that entrenched power already knows how to defeat. It has been defeating it for centuries. Everyone swept up in the movement would pay a cost beyond measure, even an heiress to the nation's most powerful media empire. In the next episode of House on Fire, the Symbionese Liberation Army has spent weeks making lists and reading newspapers, looking for the action that will salvage everything the Foster assassination failed to produce. They need a name. They need a symbol. They need someone whose disappearance will be impossible for the country to look away from. They have found her. This series has deliberately held off on telling her story, because to understand what was done to her, you first had to understand everything that made it possible. Now it's time. She is 19 years old. She is taking art history classes at UC Berkeley. She is engaged, and she has no idea what is coming. Her name is Patricia Campbell Hearst. This webcast is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research. All writing and most narration by yours truly. Theme music is Red Shift by The Grey Room with Density and Time. Additional audio recordings by members of the Symbionese Liberation Army.